Now, in the Middle East particularly, a lot of the conflicts are religious conflicts. What do you bring to the table regarding that?
Well, I think it's a recognition that it's not just religious conflicts. There are other issues at play. There's food, there's water, there's all sorts of other historical issues. There are other players who are influencing what happens there. So I think it's getting them to recognize that it's probably never just a religious issue, that there are a lot of other issues that if you could get them to agree on the importance of those issues, that the religious issue becomes less important.
And if I may interject, just because of my own personal bias in these areas, I think the religion's actually used as a kind of a tool to push people's emotional buttons, as it were, to actually inflame or to create more tension that doesn't really have to exist. And I think especially a lot of younger people, they're not that bent on which religion is it. They're more bent on, can we actually feed our families, or can we look for a future that has education, that sort of thing. So you have some of the religious sort of oligarch types trying to cling to these rigid religious concepts as a control mechanism to hopefully get their little empire built or whatever it is. But then at the other end of the spectrum, you have ordinary people to say, I just want to live and have a better life. And so maybe this, at a kind of a threshold point, can these religious extremes be less relevant than the actual sort of everyday person's world in that context?
Well, there's an awful lot of violent rhetoric. I mean, there are cultures where people are explicitly taught to hate the other side. Of
course, and that's
been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years.
And that's like a propaganda system that is perhaps, hopefully, starting to dissipate, because as mostly these kinds of totalitarian religious, sort of what I call fanatical religious systems, take hold where there's isolation, where people have been forced to sort of believe only one thing and they don't have any other access except that. Now that we live in this sort of transcendental media world, a lot of people are saying, well, wait a second now, there is another world out there. And in other words, I think that's why there's so much of this conflict going on, because people fear losing their power. They've used these fanatical religious concepts to control their little chunk of the land or the tribal entities they're supposedly dominating. And they're finding out that unless they keep that fanatical religious process going, they're going to lose out. They're not going to be the grand, sort of ruler of their little domain. So there's a lot of interest in trying to preserve these fanatical beliefs versus ordinary people who just say, look, can't we just live and sort this out? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of these have multiple layers of historical issues on top of them. So colonial issues that go back. Yeah. You have, certainly from recent decades, the socialist, communist political viewpoint versus the capitalist viewpoint. So all of these layers of history and different types of conflicts are put on top of this supposedly religious issue. And I think a lot of these things are, it's hard to pull and tease one out of the other, and you need to recognize all of them.
Religion has quite a powerful force. There are many people who will die for their religion. There are not that many people who will give their lives for modern liberalism, for example. And if you're willing to die for your cause and your opponent is not willing to die for his cause, you have a big advantage.
And some people want to maintain that because it's a very easy, simple, low-cost tool to sort of get your way. In other words, the people who die in the street think they're going to get their virgins or something, they're just expendable. But there's people above them, of course, that like to use that for their own purposes. And I think that process may be, hopefully, dissipating as media processes and sort of access to an outside world becomes more commonplace.
Well, do you think that the desire to dominate is a basic aspect of human life? I mean, what are the things that drive human behavior? The desire to raise yourself above others, to rule others by force, seems to be pretty attractive for some people.
For some people, and I think that it's a very tribalistic mechanism that's been around for many thousands of years, but we're living in a different time. So people are beginning to recognize that unless you abandon that tribal mechanism that was successful in a certain context, in a kind of an evolutionary scale, we're crossing into a threshold where it's not going to work anymore. You're going to have to, like it or not, figure out ways to cooperate. Otherwise, all bets are off.
And I think that's why the Millennium Project tries to identify all of these other issues and get people to agree on some other more fundamental basic things. And again, push this unresolvable conflict to the edges so that you may never resolve that issue. But if you can get enough of the issues resolved that you can at least have peace and at least create an economy that's self-sustaining and lifts all boats, then I think you'll find a lot of the reason that people follow these religious precepts, or at least politically, will fall away. At least that's the goal. That's the challenge I think that we have. And
what about identity, like national identity? Like some people say, well, the whole human race has to learn to work together as a whole. And some people say, I don't identify with people who live in certain countries. I'm willing to work cooperatively with the people in my tribe to advance the benefits to my tribe, but all of the other tribes are my competitors.
Well, the concept of sovereignty is a very, very complex sort of a holographic world by itself. And I personally talk a lot about personal sovereignty, and I look at things like, food sovereignty is like a separate issue and things kind of things. But the whole idea of saying this is my flag and this is my religious symbol and therefore I must die for it and kill anybody else that intrudes upon it. As I said, this is a very sort of stuck in the mud with no potential for progress past the point we're at now. It's almost like a cliff, and if we don't get over that cliff and kind of figure out a different way to glide on with our hang glider or something, it's not going to work.
When those people start acquiring nuclear weapons, it gets kind of serious.
It gets a little more serious, that's true. but actually, as one who actually worked in a nuclear weapons lab, I can tell you from direct experience, it's a major concern. If I had to blurt out my personal thoughts for what I think is the most dangerous thing around the corner, it's probably going to be something biological. I don't really think nuclear weapons are that big of a deal.
Biological weapons?
Either something biological weapons or something that simply sprouts up because of an accident, and that's very likely, or things that have mutated because of strange agricultural practices, which I could elaborate on if you wish. But the whole idea of recombinant proteomics, synthetic biology, sort of this intersection between nanotech and biotech and being able to really construct organisms from scratch, this is all done. I mean, it's out of the box. It's not something hidden away in a lab. It's being spread throughout the world. And for good or for bad, or for better or worse, these are powerful tools. But can these tools be badly abused? I would say yes. However, can they also solve a lot of problems? The answer is yes. And as I often describe in some of my talks, I sort of show a graph that says, here's what I call the spiritual maturity index of our civilization, and here's the technology spike. It's almost like a vertical line. So theoretically, we should try to bring those lines a little closer together.
Well, it looks like there are two trends. There's one trend of people identifying with humanity as a whole and trying to unite. And then there's another trend leading toward increasing fragmentation. Do you have a sense of which trend is gaining the advantage over the other?
It depends on who you ask, and that's partly why the Millennium Project does what it does, because it wants to find that out.
Well, I think there's also, some of the fragmentation is based on a lot of other things besides religion or ethnic affinity. We use online social networks to allow people to form virtual tribes globally. So you have diasporas of various kinds where these people are able to, for religious or ethnic reasons, they're able to link to each other and feel part of a global network of people, and that actually has probably some positive benefits. But you also find people who are forming virtual tribes around other things like types of technology or things that relate to the type of work that they do. And so I think in some sense the fragmentation may actually get bigger, but that in and of itself links them to humanity as a whole, because the whole system
people have more of a choice of who they want to connect to. They're driven more by where their passions are and what actually makes sense to them, as opposed to what they've been told to believe through some kind of dogma lens, as it were.
And this is a great topic, which I'd love to continue on, but I also want to get to the topic of sustainable agriculture, which is another one of the 15 challenges.
Right.
Now, you're the co-founder of a company called General Hydroponics.
That's correct.
What's going on in the world of sustainable agriculture right now?